Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 15th, 2017, and this is our 11th interview in a series on Mormon leaders and inappropriate interviews with bishops, stake presidents, mission presidents, etc. I know that seems like a lot, but we're wanting to do a series because we want to get a lot of different perspectives. We interviewed Sam Young, Bishop Sam Young, yesterday. Sam is leading this most recent effort to try and get the church to change. He's got a petition you can sign at protectldschildren.org. We're really hoping to get 10,000 signatures. Sam and his wife and his mother, Birdie, are going to be on Temple Square December 1st and 2nd to show their passion for this issue, and we're going to try and get some people together to support them as well. But today we're going to be interviewing Sarah. Sarah is not her real name, and she's not going to be using video, but Sarah wants to tell us her story about an inappropriate interview or sets of interviews with church leaders. So Sarah, I want to welcome you, but I'll welcome you to Mormon Stories, but I also want to welcome everyone who's joining us on Facebook Live. We hope that you will share questions and comments there. That makes these interviews more interactive and more interesting. But Sarah, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks so much, John. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you give us a little bit about your background in church prior to these interviews, just so we kind of know where you're coming from a little bit.
All right, so the interviews that I'm talking about occurred when I was about 16 years old, and although I'm not using my first name, I don't mind saying I'm 38 now, so more than 20 years ago. And so my background in the church is that I was born and raised in the Covenant. I was actually born and raised in Canada, and
so this is a Canadian perspective.
This is a Canadian perspective.
And I think we had one other Canadian perspective so far, so you'll be the second Canadian perspective, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, for most listeners, you may not know that Canada and Alberta in particular is kind of an Orthodox place. We're definitely a minority compared to what you would experience in Utah, but the church is strong and has really long and deep roots there, and they really pride themselves on their orthodoxy, particularly in Alberta. So I was born and raised in the Covenant there. My mother is a convert. My father is now an ex-Mormon, but was at the time, pioneer stock. He was actually born in Provo. So I had this, kind of traditional Mormon upbringing, although I would say my parents were interesting in that my mother was true believing Mormon, the TBM. However, she was progressive and feminist. And then my father was always some of a New Order Mormon.
Okay, all right.
And then as for myself, I was an honor roll on every sports team, kind of all-round, all-star kind of kid. I was really, really straight arrow kid. So I loved pleasing grown-ups. I loved pleasing church leaders. And I did very, very little wrong in my life wrong from a church perspective. I put a lot of pressure on myself to be perfect and have that more imperfection problem that a lot of young women in particular experience. So when I was about 16, actually a few months shy of my 16th birthday, as they say.
I get it.
I went to EFY. And at EFY, I heard this, kind of really fire and brimstone fireside about sexual purity, and in particular about masturbation. And at that point, I had engaged in some masturbation, but it hadn't even occurred to me that it was masturbation or that there was a problem with it. But sitting in this EFY fireside, it dawned on me, oh my goodness, I have committed the sin next to murder. And, when I went to see the Book of Mormon musical and they have the scary Mormon
spooky Mormon hell dream.
The spooky Mormon hell dream. It was like so hilarious to me. I was crying, but also crying because that spooky Mormon hell dream isn't funny when you're
Mm.
living it, right? Like, so like, I am as bad as Hitler. Yeah, that's how I felt.
Mm.
So like, I was racked with the pains of hell. So here I am, this little perfectionist Mormon. I didn't even know what I was doing was wrong. But then I was hit with, oh my gosh, I have masturbated, and that means I'm going to hell. Um,
Mm.
so I was racked with the pains of hell, and because I'm a very studious, good little early morning seminary student, I knew that, you know, if you commit the sin next to murder, you have to go see your bishop. So I went to make an appointment with my bishop, and I actually pulled up my journal from when this was happening and read through it, because there was something I had forgotten, and I think this is interesting. So I had tried to make an appointment with my bishop, and my parents got wind of it, and my parents, being kind of progressive New Order Mormons, tried to stop me.
Mm.
Um, so I was very tight-lipped. I didn't tell them what I was making this appointment for, but they both were like, we don't really want you to go see the bishop unless you really, really have to. But they both said, you know, you don't have to see the bishop for every little thing. You can keep some things private. You don't need to meet one-on-one with the bishop. We'd love to be there and help you. And they really strongly discouraged me.
Mm.
Um, and you know, I think my dad had said, you know, the bishop's time is valuable. You don't need to bother him unless it's very serious. And I
Mm.
looked at him in the eyes and was like, it is very serious.
Mm.
And carried on. And then I had all this guilt and shame, because my parents are looking at me like, oh my goodness, what's she into? You know, is she sleeping around? Is she on drugs? And I'm a kid who'd never even kissed a boy. You know, like, you know, and so I had all this shame that my parents are looking at me like I'm evil. But my parents really did try and stop and protect me. But I had been so conditioned to believe that what I was doing was like the sin next to murder, then that I had to meet with my bishop.
Mm.
So, as I said, I was 15, almost 16, and my bishop, I don't know how old he was, but just from what I remember what he looked like, I'd say early 60s.
Okay.
I mean, he may have been mid 50s and just a gray mid 50s, but you know, he was significantly older than me. Um, and I don't actually think that he was turned on by the interview or anything like that, but the way that he proceeded was traumatizing to me. And so I went in. Finally, I get my appointment with my bishop, because my parents can see I'm hell bent determined to do it. And I go in, and um, he he confirms this is the sin next to murder, and you know, you're not going to be able to be in the laurel presidency when you come up next on your next birthday, and you're not going to be able to do these things. And but what was really bothersome was that he started asking questions about, tell me about the masturbation. When do you do it? Is it late at night? Is it early in the morning? Is it in your bedroom? Do you do it in your bed? Do you do it in the bathroom? Um, uh, can you describe what you do to masturbate? And for the most part, I deflected these questions, but the invasiveness of them was really deeply bothering to me. And having to describe in detail that experience really, really bothered me. And he didn't just give me a little slap on the wrist. He said, here is the miracle of forgiveness. I want you to read it cover to cover. And you're not going to be able to take the sacrament or participate in public prayers in church until I say you can.
Mm.
And so I didn't have a real timeline of how long that was going to be, but I went away just horrified, like, and really believed that I could never be forgiven, and that this was something that I couldn't get over. And I even felt, okay, I'm going to read the miracle of forgiveness. I'm going to give him the answers he wants, and we're going to move forward. But I know that this is such a stain on me that it's horrible.
Mm.
So I read the miracle of forgiveness, and which confirmed these suspicions and made me feel worse and worse and worse. And it also communicated something else to me. And I'm not sure if this was from miracle forgiveness or from the bishop or from other messages, but in the course of this process, I understood that me as a young woman engaging in these things was particularly sexually deviant, that this was kind of like the natural inclination for men, but that women were supposed to be asexual, or to be sexualized by men but not sexual beings in their own right. And so it made me feel even filthier that I had engaged in an expression of my own kind of sexual desire. So my he never called it disfellowshipping, but I'm kind of calling that now in retrospect, in hindsight.
Because it's the same punishment, right? I mean,
Right.
you're told you can't take the sacrament. You're in trouble, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have full privileges.
Exactly. So, so I don't, I think that the disfellowshipping lasted 4 months, which is like a fairly significant amount of time. Um, and I remember and every meeting, so I had to meet with him kind of bi-weekly, except for this did go over the summer and we had summer holidays. So I don't know that it's strictly set to that, but kind of bi-weekly over 4 months. And at every meeting, it was the same thing, like, have you masturbated? Where? When? And
Did you quote mess up during that
um,
time?
I did, but I lied to him.
Oh my gosh. What was that like? What
It
was
was
that like
horrible. It was
to
horrible.
to lie to someone you think is God's representative, right?
Yeah, it was horrible. And frankly, I'm the worst liar in the world, and it like sent my stress levels like through the roof. But I just knew that I had to get out of this. And I remember my mom had said to me, like, we're on vacation and it's now been like 3 months and I haven't been taking the sacrament. My mom's like, honey, I think you need the sacrament to like help you feel whole. Like, I don't, this seems like way too long. And then so I'm starting to get this little bit of pushback from my family. And I was like, I just gotta stop this. Like, I gotta give the bishop his answers, and I gotta move on with my life, because like, I am eternally tainted, and nothing's gonna fix
This
that.
idea of saying you can't take the sacrament and you can't go to the temple, not only is it public shaming and just really sort of severe for someone who really believes, but it's also with taking away from them the spiritual support or sustenance that they could really use if they're trying in some way to actually become more righteous or more whole or whatever. So it almost seems like a counterproductive punishment.
I couldn't agree more, John. Like, that's exactly right. And I think that's exactly what my mom was trying to say to me. My mom was and is a true believing Mormon, but she's a very thoughtful Mormon, and she was concerned about my spirituality, and she knew that I was like, I was the top of the seminary class. I memorized every scripture. I cared. I prayed and read my scriptures daily. Like, she knew that this was significant to me. And so she was really like, I think you should consider starting to take the sacrament again if you feel comfortable. I don't think you need to wait for the bishop permission. And I never spoke a word to her of what happened in the bishop's office. Never, never, never. My parents never knew, and still don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, just a couple comments from our listeners. Pat says, "I'm so glad my kids will not be raised with this guilt and shame." Pat, we hope that's true too, not just for you, but for even Mormons who stay in the church. We hope they'll protect their children. Amanda writes, uh, sort of detailed questions like the ones the bishop asked you fetishize the problem. He may not have found it sexy, but who he reports this to probably has. It's a way to shame people and hold power over them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know what was in my bishop's mind, and I don't want to speak for him, but that's certainly how I felt, and I felt like I was like reliving the masturbation. And like I said, I didn't even think that the masturbation was a sin when I had done it. I didn't even know, like, I didn't put those words together, so it didn't feel wrong. I didn't think it was wrong, um, but what I believe is that the bishop was trying to counsel me, like, oh, if we can figure out if it's late at night, maybe I can give her some patterns, to avoid the late at night, or
Yeah,
if, I think he was trying to be a psychologist,
right.
which he was not. He was a real estate developer, right? Um, so I think, yeah, I think subjectively he was coming from a good place, but I think there's just something about the structure and the way he was trained and the way that he was taught to be a bishop, that there was some fetishizing going on in there, and that it is very shameful and a way of holding power over women. I absolutely think that. I just don't know if I think that that was,
Yeah, his
at the
intent.
forefront of his
Yeah,
mind.
behavior can have the effect of something, or it can have the perception of something regardless of intent. So if I say something that feels sexually harassing, it doesn't matter if I mean it to be or not, right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
it's a sexually harassing comment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Heather writes, it's never occurred to me that by them calling it disfellowshipping, it is a way to put fear back into the sinner, thus almost forcing its members to get back in line for fear of further public shaming. So in your case, they didn't call it disfellowshipment, but she's just making a comment about
Yeah, no,
that
and
process.
I think that, and I kind of think that that's what he was going for. Like, I know he wasn't a huge fan of my dad and his new Mormon order Mormon ways,
Mm-hmm.
um, and like, you know, in previous interviews with him, he had kind of said, you know, maybe your clothes don't meet the for strength of youth uh, mandate, which I never understood where I was coming up short, because I didn't wear porn shoulders or anything. Maybe,
Mm-hmm.
you know, maybe too tight or something. I don't know. I never understood that. But he had kind of said those kinds of things to me. So I think he may have come down a bit hard on me to like get me to fall in line, um, you know, to be a more orthodox member, because he knows I'm coming from a little bit from a place of unorthodox family. I don't know, but
Interesting.
I always had that sense that he was that this was a process of trying to get me in line.
Yeah. Wow, we're getting some great comments. I hope it's okay. Amy writes, shaming, it almost seems like some are made examples of to keep others worried about public shaming, and it perpetuates the cycle. That's interesting, because if you're sitting in the audience and you see people not taking the sacrament or not blessing the sacrament, or you notice someone's not at the temple trip, it's like a shock to you, saying, boy, I better not ever screw up, or I'll be there, publicly shamed as well. That's a really interesting dynamic I hadn't thought of, Amy. So thanks for sharing. Um, Amanda writes, exactly. Each time you see him or who you were forced to report this to, you relive the shame, and it's insane. I don't think he was trying to be a psychologist. I think he had poorly written instruction by poor intentioned people. And then Caleb writes, there's zero training. Anything you want to say to Amanda or Caleb?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's zero training. As I said before, I do think he was trying to help. I never got the sense that he was like turned on by this process. But the reality is that he doesn't have the training. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he's following in these patterns that are super harmful. And you know, I am married to a true believing Mormon, and so my children are being raised in the church now. And you know, my daughter is 7, and we're coming up on the age of when kids are starting to go into interviews. And you know, just thinking about this issue just sends my heart racing about this incident that happened more than 20 years ago. You know, and it's amazing to me that this is relatively minor, compared to the experiences of other people, that it has such an impact on me more than 20 years later, and that has such an impact on what I want for my children, and you know, how I'm going to navigate that with my mixed faith marriage, you know. So yeah, I mean, the structure and the system is horrendous, and it should not be this way.
Yeah. Rob writes, my bishop insisted on a masturbation journal. I had to report every time it happened and what ideas I was thinking about while it happened. This was the only way he would allow me to be approved for a mission. Oh my gosh, I've never, Rob, we need to have you on Mormon Stories to tell your story, but can you imagine a masturbation journal?
Well, actually, my bishop did actually ask me to record every time I was messing up, and I just didn't do it to say I didn't screw up, right? So,
Uh,
but yeah, my bishop asked the same thing. So yeah, absolutely, that's what they're doing, and I think they're still doing it. That's the thing, John. Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
if I thought that this happened 20 years ago to me and that was bad, I would say that's bad, and it was commonplace. But we've moved forward. We haven't moved forward.
yeah,
That's what I find so problematic about this issue.
yeah. Krista writes, this conversation is so important. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your story. This behavior in the church, especially against women, absolutely has to stop. We agree. Sign the petition, everybody. The petition is as protectldschildren.org. Really quickly, Sarah, because we've got to get to one more interview. Anything else to your story, how it affected you, how it's affected you into marriage? And you don't have to, make something up, or, if it's not natural, just anything else you want to share about how this experience, anything else that happened in the experience, or how it's affected you.
Yeah, this issue has followed me my whole life. I've had nightmares about it, and for the most part, I think I'm a well-functioning human being, so I'm lucky. But as I got married, I got married in the temple to a worthy priesthood holder, and I remember worrying about whether I was worthy from this issue from back when I was 15 years old. And I remember wondering about how do we engage in sexual activity and what's appropriate for me to feel. And I mean, I hope this isn't too personal, but I was always so worried about him having sexual pleasure compared to me that it kind of stunted that growth on my own part in the early stages of our marriage. So I think those messages about women as sexualized beings rather than sexual beings really got ingrained into me. And so, yeah, I've carried that with me my whole life. And I think that's wrong. And I don't want that for other people.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword in the church as a woman, because either it seems like you're given excessive shame and guilt for being sort of a sexual being, or you aren't even acknowledged as a sexual being, and in some ways, non-acknowledgement is even more damaging than excessive shame. And so it's tricky, right? And this is, Jennifer Finlayson Fife, I did an interview with her that just talked about how important it is for Mormon women to own their sexuality and to think of themselves as sexual beings, and that gratification, their sexual gratification really matters, right? Their pleasure, their sexual gratification. And somehow too many Mormon women reach marriage where that's not even on their mind. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. And the work that she has done was, I remember listening to a podcast of her and just being like, yes, finally, and it was like my brains were being blown out. I was just so excited about this because it's just not a message that I ever heard in my life. And it was so important to me. And unfortunately, I didn't hear it until I was kind of in like the middle or beginning of my faith transition crisis, and I would have liked to have heard that when I was a true believing Mormon. And I wish that message was loud and clear to active believing Mormons.
Absolutely. Alma writes, I was never LDS. Is it common for children to have these kinds of interviews with their bishops alone without parents? Alma, unfortunately, every single Mormon youth 12 and up has these sorts of interviews on a regular basis with their bishops. So the whole reason we're doing this interview is because 12-year-old girls alone in a room with the 60-year-old men are being asked if they masturbate and how they masturbate and who they had sex with, or who they had a sexual experience with, or who touched their breast, or was there penetration, or was there an orgasm or not, and was there anal. It's some of the most graphic, disturbing things I've ever heard in a Mormon context. So yes, Alma, that's why we're doing this series. Rob writes, oh, the stories I could share. Amanda writes, my bishop asked me to write down each time I found a woman attractive where I was and what I was doing. I didn't do it either, but geez, that'd be a pretty big book. So I guess Amanda was being counseled about same-sex attraction, I'm guessing, which is its own workshop, as they say. Let's see. Melissa writes, abuse is abuse. Pat writes, Sarah, this issue is going to come up big time as your kids get older. My kids were just about your kids' age when we left. I know it's hard, but you got to establish boundaries between yourself and your kids and the church. That's great advice from Pat. For all the people that are still in the church. Jessica writes, I had to go through a bishop's council at 19 and tell a room full of men about my sexual experiences, and it was beyond traumatizing. 11 years later, and I still have dreams where I've done something wrong and I have to go to the bishop's office and confess. And yes, Jessica, it's not just children and youth that are being traumatized. Adults who are having healthy, normal sexual experiences are being shamed, by bishops and stake presidents and high councils, and it's really terrible, even for adults. So we got to stop the kids things, but adults are just as troubling. Scott writes, amazing how many of us have the same story. Spencer writes, I'm perplexed why the church even cares. Now that I'm out, I just can't see what the obsession with other people's personal sexual experiences is all about. And the final comment I'll read, after sitting through this whole court of love thing myself at 19, I was just utterly shamed. But as an adult, I can see how creepy it is for a 19-year-old to be asked specific details about positions, etc. I met a Never Mo that told me she had an affair with a Mormon who was on a high council. He would sit through these courts of love and then go over to her house and have sex with her. I had left the church when I met her, and I can so see the pervertedness of these bishops and high councilmen actually getting off and being titillated by getting to hear these stories. And we should say that we can't assume that all church leaders get titillated, but we know that there are many that do. One of the interviews we did recently was with a man who eventually, within a year, was excommunicated, and he was the one asking about being fingered and all sorts of really graphic things to a young teenage girl in California. So anyway, we've got 107 listeners. That's a great audience. We're going to be ending this interview and starting one right back up again with someone from the UK. We're going to get a UK experience in here. But before we do, Sarah, is there any final words or perspectives that you want to share on this topic?
No, but thank you so much for having me, John, and thanks so much for all the work that you do.
My pleasure. All right. Well, Sarah, this is a really important contribution. Listeners, check out protectldschildren.org. Please sign the petition. Thanks for listening. Support us at mormonstories.org. Donate if you can. $10, $50, $100 a month can really make a difference. Thanks to all who support us. And check back on the Mormon Stories podcast page in like 1 minute, because I'll be starting an interview with David Shepard from the UK. All right, Sarah, thanks so much. And thanks to all our listeners who gave comments and questions on Facebook Live. It just makes it more interactive. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 15th, 2017, and we are on our 12th interview on a new Mormon Stories Podcast series on inappropriate interviews with Mormon bishops and stake presidents around sexuality. So we've interviewed 11 people, and this is our 12th. We're really excited for those who are joining us on Facebook Live. These comments and questions from Facebook Live make it way more interactive. And today we have with us, for the first time in this series, someone from the United Kingdom. And he's willing to show his face and use his real name. And so without any further ado, David Shepard, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Cool. Thanks, John.
All right. So tell us a little bit about your background in the church before you dive in kind of to your story, if that's okay.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in the church. I feel like on this program, I need to say that I'm like a 7th generation Mormon, but I've just my grandparents and my parents.
That's legit. In the UK, that's a legit deal.
Yeah, it's a real experience. Yeah, so I was, like I said, born and raised in the church. Largely a positive experience growing up in the church. It's kind of, I feel like for a lot of people, especially myself, it's kind of all good until you hit your teens. From the sounds of it, other people have this experience, and it sort of goes down a bit with the early introduction to this particular topic. I served a mission at 19. I went to Germany, the Germany Berlin mission, 2010 to 2012. I got married in the temple. I'm since divorced. And yeah, I've been sort of not really attending church since about 2013. And yeah, I'm just this was an important topic. As soon as it came up, I really wanted to talk about it.
Well, thank you for being willing to share your story with us. Why don't we jump in, David? Tell us how the interviews first started.
So the earliest interviews I remember having was probably when I was about 13, 14. And it's funny because it was at a time where I didn't know a great deal at that time. We just by that age in school, at least in my experience, we didn't really have much education at that point. You know, it's like early sex ed stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
wasn't very knowledgeable. We didn't get, obviously at church you don't really touch the subject until those years. And yeah, I remember having these interviews. I think it kind of starts when you go to the temple, as a youth, for temple baptisms. And I remember there's a specific interview I had that wasn't sort of sexual in nature at all, but it set the tone for this particular, you know, whenever this situation would come up again, it would set the tone for every other interview that I'd had. And it was when I think the counselor of the bishopric at the time gave a you know, who I loved him to death. He was a really, really lovely guy. And he was normally very jokey, but in this instance he got very serious and said, you know, David, I want you to know that that at this time I'm not speaking as myself. For the next few minutes, you will be speaking to the Savior's representative, and sort of by proxy,
Holy moly!
the Savior himself. So I'm just staring at him like, okay. um, so I lied through my teeth, and didn't sort of discuss my masturbatory habits. But like I said, that kind of set the tone for the types of meetings that they were, and not that they didn't necessarily come from a good place, because again, you know, I love the guy to this day. And one thing I also wanted to make clear before I talk about this subject, which I'm sure has been brought up in the other interviews. I've not been able to watch them yet, but it's that I have a firm belief that for the most part, the people that do these interviews they're operating within a broken system.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
you know, I don't think that the majority of them are getting all this gratification. I'm sure most of them
Absolutely.
often feel embarrassed. When I was a
Yeah.
missionary, I gave as a district leader, I gave interviews to people who would be, you know, I would give them permission to join the church. And you know, and I had to ask questions like, have you had an abortion, and have you engaged in a same-sex relationship? So like, I know how uncomfortable those interviews are. That no one wants to do them. But
Sure.
yeah, so the ones that I wanted to talk about mainly today was the experience that I had in the MTC, in the Missionary Training Center, in Provo. And I was probably a few weeks into my experience there, and I was basically, me and a couple of other missionaries who I really got on well with. We just kind of stayed up a little bit longer, like everyone else had gone to bed 10:30, and we just sort of stayed up and just chatted about life, and got to know each other and stuff like that. And sort of through these conversations, we, you know, naturally, we're men, we talk about ladies. That's what we like doing.
Mm-hmm.
And just sort of our experiences, not like in graphic ways, but just having girlfriends and dating and all that kind of stuff. So eventually I sort of felt comfortable enough to bring up how I'd sort of had interactions or or sort of experiences with women, whereby I'd had to go to the bishop and sort of got that resolved. And I knew that I had left some things on the table. Like I hadn't spoken about everything in my mission interviews leading up to the mission. And the reason for that was because I wasn't just desperate to not talk about. I just didn't want to have those interviews again. But I felt at the time that I had a spiritual experience, a very powerful one that was kind of saying to me that I was going to serve a mission at this time. Like, this was my time. You know, there are people waiting for me. So I worried that if I were to be completely honest about my sexual history, that I would be stopped from going at that time. So my justification when I prayed about it and I felt a reassurance and almost a forgiveness really about the things that I'd done independent of any kind of leader, just on my own, you know, just praying to God, and I felt that reassurance. So I thought, actually, I don't need to talk to anyone about this. But in the missionary training center, that probably like every 2 weeks, you know, these massive meetings that they hold, they sort of would do these guilt-ridden talks about needing to you know, have basically confessed everything, and if there's anyone in this room that, you know, needs to feels the need to confess, then, you know, we'd encourage you to do so. Da, da, da. So, but it was mainly this discussion I had with my friends at the time that led me to think, okay, maybe I should just make sure that I'm doing all the right things, and I go to the branch president. And so I went to the branch president, and who was a bit of a severe man, but he was kind. He was just a bit scary. And I basically just told him what I had omitted from previous interviews that I'd had. You know, and he nodded, and you know, he seemed to be very understanding, and yeah, he just said, you know, yeah, Elder Shepherd, thank you for telling me, and you know, I appreciate it. You know, it's a brave thing to do. Da, 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 da. But this is not within my jurisdiction. Sort of as the branch president, it's, you know, so it's severe enough somehow that it needs to be higher. And I will state for the record as well, I hadn't had sex before my mission, you know, so it was anything below that.
So like petting with a girl kind of thing,
Yeah,
as Mormons would
petting,
call it. Yeah.
that wonderful term that no one understands. How old is that term? I feel like that's got to be like the 1950s or something. Petting. I feel like I'm petting a dog.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, so he basically just said that he, you know, he would be in touch, that he would sort of have to arrange an interview with for those who don't know, the way the MTC is organized is it's kind of like the church in that you've got, you know, you're in your branches, and then there's kind of like the equivalent of the stake president, and, you know, the MTC councils are like the area authorities almost. So I went to the equivalent of the stake president, in charge of our branch and a few others. And so it was we're in it's called a large group meeting. So there were a few groups of missionaries that are having a lesson, and then I got on the intercom, Elder Shepherd, will you please report to the da, 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 you know, wherever it was, which naturally just stopped my heart. And obviously most people in the room didn't know who I was, but the people who did, you know, are all sort of staring at me, and I'm like, okay.
Oh,
So
wow, that's embarrassing.
and I knew what it was about, so it was kind of yeah, it was frightening, because I really, you know, I didn't think that it was that big of a thing, which is why I even felt okay to go to the branch president about it, but apparently it was. So yeah, so I went to this this other leader, and so what so what happened after that sort of was a very, very long, in-depth, and just an extensive interview process that lasted from, I think my it started at 10:30, I'll go into a few of the details in it, but I wasn't finished until about 4 o'clock.
Oh my gosh.
So it was an entire day of being in these interviews. That it's crazy to think, and I knew that it was weird and a bit over the top at the time, but it wasn't until years later when I look back at that and think, was I really in there for that long? And I was. Like, I remember the day really vividly, and it was just, it was exhausting at the time.
So just because we're trying to do these 15, 20 minutes, how do you
Yeah.
summarize 5 hours in just a couple minutes? Tell us what he was asking.
So the questions that I was asked, I mean, I think I'd heard that in the last interview. Did you, like, did you orgasm? Did they orgasm? Over the clothes, under the clothes. What types of porn did I watch?
Like the types of porn. Why don't you describe?
What categories did I look at? And the funny, which I'm willing to share now. But the funny thing is, which because he kind of said, well, so he went straight to child porn, which, like, I was horrified. I was like, what? No. And then, but below that was, so have you looked at homosexual porn? So I'm thinking, you went from child porn to homosexual porn. Like, that's just the fact that there was even a conflation of the two was shocking at the time. I thought that was really weird. And yeah, it was just I didn't understand the reason for what I was why I was talking about these particular things, and the fact that I was having to share this with a complete stranger, because it was with this idea that we're doing this because if you don't, you won't be forgiven. You won't. You're going to get to. I'm going to get to heaven, and I'm going to be at the doors, and they're going to be like, "Oh, sorry, Dave, you're a good bloke, but you're not coming in because you forgot to mention that detail." So so he basically felt the need to. I kind of had to persuade him that I was sexually ignorant. So maybe a little bit more than I actually was at the time. So, I kind of had to be like, yeah, my parents came from a certain generation, didn't talk about it. I didn't really hear from much at school, and things like that. So because I wanted him to basically blame that on the reason as to why I was so horribly promiscuous. And yeah, so basically by the end of this time, I mean, eventually he said, okay, so we're going to have to call you stake president, which again, heart dropping. So I was just blubbering to my stake president on the phone and telling him how sorry I was that I was, lied to him, and that I, X, Y, and Z, whatever I said at the time. And then he asked me then to leave the room, and that he would speak to my stake president alone. They were speaking for a bit, and then I was invited back in, and then I was told that I needed to give him basically the names of the people involved, that I've been sexually involved with. And by this point, I had so much anxiety and knots in my stomach that I was on the verge of throwing up. Like, I was 95% there. Like, when you start salivating a little bit, and I could feel it coming. And I said, look, can I just come back in here in like 5 minutes? Like, I need to throw up right now because it was getting too much. And then he looked at me, and he didn't take his eyes off me. He looked at me, and he sort of grabbed the bin or the rubbish thing under his desk, and just pulled it outwards, and was just kind of like, well, you can throw up. You can throw up right ahead there, elder. Which for me, and especially looking back, was absolutely horrific, because I I was essentially trapped. You know, I couldn't go. He was physically not allowing me to leave the room because I was going to throw up. So that itself was a very traumatic event. And I wasn't allowed, you know, when we went to lunch, I wasn't allowed to leave his side. You know, I didn't eat anything for lunch, and he was sort of eating away. And then after all this, you know, yeah. So and after I said that I was going to throw up, I didn't, fortunately, but I started to try to say the words, and I couldn't get any words out because I felt so sick. And so I sort of said, you know, I can't speak. And he replied, well, try spelling them. So I then had to try to dictate letters to spell out names of people and
What was
things
that
like that.
like, having to name names?
That was horrible because as far as I was concerned, this is my business. You know, I'm choosing to speak about these things personally, and it has nothing to do with anyone else. Nothing to do with it.
Because it's
Especially since
spiritual,
it's
right?
about,
It's
yeah,
spiritual. It's about your
exactly.
mission. It's about your well-being, right?
Yeah, it was my sign and commitment to God that I wanted to do this right. You know, I wanted to start this off in the right way. I've acknowledged that I've made some mistakes, but trying to drag other people into it, I thought was disgusting. It just didn't make sense. I couldn't make the pieces fit. So after all that, you know, he basically just he says, well, Elder Shepherd, I've spoken to your stake president, and we both feel that you've been penitent. You know, you've been repentant. That you're being honest in what you're saying, and da da da. I'm like, yeah, great, thanks. I'm glad you could see that. But then he said, but it's still not within my jurisdiction.
Oh my gosh!
So I
After
said,
all that,
yeah. I was like, well, where's this going then? And then I had to, I left, and he said, well, you know, you're going to have an interview with one of the MTC presidency. And I said, I asked him for a favor. Unfortunately, he did agree to it. I said, do you mind if you can just go in there and prep him? Just like tell my story and just let me walk in and discuss it with him. Because by that point, I'd retold this story so many times, with, you know, in all the intimate details. I'm like, I can't physically stomach doing it again. The guy was really nice. I felt much more comfortable with this next person. It wasn't very long, like 20 minutes. I spoke to him, and again he said, you know, I really appreciate you coming. You know, you're really very honest and brave. Da, da, da. But this isn't within my jurisdiction.
oh my goodness!
So by this point, I just like, I think I raised my voice a little bit, probably more out of shock than anything, and I just said, well, where's this going? What do I need to do? Like, am I
President
gonna
Monson's on his way.
am I gonna meet Jesus soon? Is he gonna fly down and like personally punish me or something? And he said that, well, you're gonna, you know, your case will be brought before the brethren. I was like, who is the brethren? I don't know these things. And he's like, well, the brethren, to do with the missionaries, consisted of a group of 70s and 2 apostles. And so I said, well, who are the apostles? Because that will make the difference. You know, if I get a light one, forget. Yeah. So he said, Russell M. Nelson. I'm like, okay, seems all right. And he said Jeffrey R. Holland, and I just wanted to walk out the door straight away. I'm like, well, I'm done. Yeah, I basically had to wait until the next day. And again, I was called on the intercom and told to arrive. And fortunately, I had been found, you know, clean, and that, you know, they were happy to have, this is how it felt like, they were happy to have forgiven me, which allowed me to go on my mission. Like, it didn't feel like this had anything to do with God or Jesus or whatever. It felt like I had to prove myself before a judge because I was the criminal guilty of these things. And that was, yeah, and on reflection, when I was going through this whole thing, I never realized how much of a criminal I actually felt. Like I'd broken the law, and that I was being treated by, you know, I was seeing these policemen that were like interviewing me about things that I'd done. And you know, when you look at what the things that I was speaking about, I mean, they're nothing. You know, they're really nothing at all.
Did you end up
Um,
meeting with an apostle?
no, so they put my I'm guessing that they wrote up notes and just sent it off
Okay,
to
got
the
it.
committee basically, and they just decided how bad I was,
And then you were exonerated.
and then I was exonerated.
So what are the short, medium, to kind of wrap this up, what were some of the short, medium, and long-term negative effects of that experience, David?
Um,
So that we can
I
understand how this harms people. How do you feel like you were harmed, short, medium, and long term, if you do?
yeah, I would say the the long term, not so much now because my belief system has changed, but at the time, um, something that the second president said to me was that because basically I'd repented of one thing, and I told him what happened, and then he said, so has anything like this happened before that or after or whatever? And I was just like, yeah, but I've already talked about that. That's already been sorted by a bishop. And he's like, well, you see, Elder Shepherd, when you break these laws, you know, it's not you're not just dealing with the one thing. It unlocks all of your other sins, and they're there too that you have to deal with. So I'm like, so I'm not just on trial now for this, I'm on trial for like everything sexually that I've possibly done in my life, you know, in all my teens. So that just left me feel like I was permanently um perverse, like I was a criminal that had received its judgment, and I was allowed to go on my mission. But it made me feel like that I was, you know, kind of this sexual creature that had to be controlled, and that it was always going to be this thing I had to worry about in my life. So I always worried, you know, when I came back from a mission, and when, you know, if I'd masturbated or something, like that one time where I did that, that suddenly, based on what he told me, that unlocked everything else that I'd done. So I spent the rest of my time in the church up until the time that I left, feeling guilty for things that I'd done for the past 10 years. And so that, I think that had severe impacts on my self-esteem. Yeah, like I said, I felt, I mean, I felt abused based on those experiences. Especially in the MTC, I felt like I experienced extreme abuse, by the leaders, who I understand trying to do the right thing, but the what's actually happening is completely wrong. And I suffered, yeah, mental health wise, I suffered as a result. I think I've always had this looming of depression and anxiety because um, because it always follows you. You know, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you feel forgiven. It doesn't matter if you forgive yourself. This stuff always follows you wherever you go, and it will never leave you. And
Hmm.
that, I think that's extremely damaging. It was for me.
How did that affect your mental health?
I think I probably. I mean, I suffer with severe depression now, and I've been you know, been treated for the past few years in order to deal with it. But I feel like my experience of depression happened a lot earlier than even I can probably really recognize. I think probably from, again, the time 14, that I started to experience symptoms of it, because when I was first educated on the subject at church, I didn't really know quite what they were talking about. So I looked up chastity and like the topical guide and stuff, and it's been conflated with sin next to murder. So I'm thinking me jacking off is somehow being equated with murdering someone, you know. And so when that's in your mind as a teen, you know, that left me feeling, again, just like filthy, like I was just a disgusting individual, that just had these ghosts that I was so ashamed about. I couldn't tell anyone. Um, you know, it just it was awful, really awful.
I'm so sorry. Do you think this contributed to you leaving the church?
Um, no, it was one of the lesser things. I mean, I'm fortunate in that you know, I didn't experience physical sexual abuse from leaders. It was more, I mean, it was abuse in a different way. I left the church mainly to do with spiritual issues and historical and all the rest of them. So it had more, had more to do with those things.
Okay. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for this interview, for your willingness to share. That is a harrowing experience. Confessing on other people is something you've brought out. Just this long 5-hour interrogation plus the multiple interrogations is a new slant to it. The MTC angle is relevant, and then just this idea of, for people who are prone to depression and anxiety, this can be a really devastating thing to have to experience as well. Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate it, and we hope to have you back on Mormon Stories.
Cool. Good to talk to you, John. Take care.
Big thanks to everyone else who has joined us for today. Please sign the petition at protectldschildren.org. Please share it with others. If you've got a story you want to tell that adds something to the stories we've already heard, please share it. mormonstories@gmail.com is the email address. The website is mormonstories.org. Please donate if you value this sort of programming. Please become a monthly subscriber because it makes all this possible. David, you're awesome. A shout out to everyone across the pond, all our friends over there.
We miss you. Come back.
All right, I'll come back soon. And thanks for everyone on Facebook Live for joining us. Please tune in again soon for more Mormon Stories. Take care, everybody.